I'd like to welcome you to the keynote presentations this morning. My name's Heather Campbell. I'm from the University of Sheffield, but I'm one of the co-track chairs for the Planning Theory and Practice track at this conference. And it is my pleasure to introduce Susan Fainstein, who is the first of our keynote papers this morning. As a track chair for the Advances in Planning Theory and Practice track, I know that one of the most challenging words in that title is the "and." People do theory, people do practice, but the "and" bit is where the real challenge lies, and the challenge, I think, for us intellectually as a planning community. This is a particular challenge that I would say Susan's work really has attempted to rise to, particularly and perhaps most familiarly in her most recent book, The Just City. Careful critical analysis that highlights to us the unjust and unequal consequences of a lot of interventions and a lot of processes in the world is common to a great amount of work, particularly within social sciences more generally, but within our own field, and more particularly how the most vulnerable seem to lose out. But really that isn't enough, and if our work within the planning community, I think, should stand for anything, it is to go beyond that, and not just critically appraise those unjust and unequal outcomes for the most vulnerable, but actually rise to the challenge of seeking better, more just, more equal cities, communities, regions, and to think about how that might happen and how that might be achieved in the world. That really is what the very best of planning scholarship is about, and undoubtedly Susan's work epitomizes that very essence of planning scholarship. So you haven't come to listen to me. I'll move on to say Susan is currently the Senior Research Fellow at Harvard University in the Graduate School of Design. Until 2012, she was a Professor of Urban Planning at Harvard and is currently visiting professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School at the National University of Singapore. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Susan has to say about resilience and justice and the way she wishes to challenge us about those areas. Susan.
Thank you, Heather. It's a great pleasure to be here and also to see so many familiar faces here. I'm going to take a somewhat different approach, I think, from what I missed the original keynote, but my view of the concept of resilience is, I think, much more critical, perhaps, than some others. The term resilience, of course, is very popular right now, and the question really is this something that gives us new insights, or is it just one more buzzword? There was an issue of the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the trade journal, really, of American academic administrators. It was a special issue on resilience. I figure by the time resilience gets to the Chronicle of Higher Education, it's really been around. And they said, forget sustainability. That's passé. Today's word is, in fact, resilience. So it's clearly very stylish. Part of the reason it's so stylish is it can mean almost anything. Is it really simply an empty signifier? Simon Devoody did a piece that's been much already cited and downloaded on resilience in an issue of Planning Theory and Practice. It was titled "A Bridging Concept or a Dead End." So she basically says, well, maybe it's a bridging concept, but she isn't totally enthusiastic about it either. We see that, well, there are a whole bunch of words that we've had in planning. When I was in graduate school, it was comprehensive planning. Then that kind of got debunked, especially by my mentor, Alan Altshuler. So then we had Synergy, we had Social Capital, most recently we've had the Creative City. So then we have a whole bunch of conferences which have these kinds of titles. Now we have, in fact, a conference around resilience. What do we mean by resilience, and why is it so popular right now? Well, we've had a lot of, and I put natural in quotes, natural disasters lately, flooding, wildfires, earthquakes, tsunamis, 9/11, et cetera, which then says, well, what do we do about these? How do we prepare for them? How do we respond to them? Then the people who are concerned with social outcomes, with the effect on vulnerable people, said, well, we can't just talk about hurricanes and earthquakes. We really have to talk about economic disasters, social disasters, the impact of everything on everything. But the question then comes to be, well, if we're going to talk about the impact of everything on everything, are we talking about anything? And aren't we, in fact, in danger of painting over everything with this very broad brush? The conference mandate, in fact, indicates that resilience is about everything. It says the purpose of developing resilience is to sustain the urban and rural viability, so we're not going to leave out rural, we're not going to be just city planners, and improve the quality of life for their residents amidst the global economic and socio-political crisis and climate change. So what couldn't be encompassed basically under that call? The question then becomes, well, doesn't saying it affects everybody under all conditions and we're concerned about the quality of life of everybody, no matter where they live and no matter who they are, doesn't this in some way obfuscate the kinds of trade-offs which in fact are involved in making plans? C.S. Holling, who I have to admit I only learned about recently because resilience has not been an area in which I've worked, has had the concept of evolutionary resilience credited to him. The argument here is that although there are those who think the resilience means returning to the old normal, that in fact his argument is that resilience refers to continuous adaptation and change. It moves away from the concept of equilibrium. It also moves away from the idea that you can do linear extrapolation, which is something that planners have often been guilty of doing. Just because the economy is going up doesn't mean that next year it's not going to suddenly be going down. Holling, along with Gunderson, coined this term panarchy to mean non-hierarchically directed adaptation. Everything is feeding into everything else. There are innumerable variables. No single variable is the dominating one. And it's here in this move towards saying there's no hierarchy that I really want to question the whole concept of resilience. Because in some sense this says, well, we can't blame anybody for anything, and there's nobody who's particularly privileged, but instead all these things are happening and they're not under the control of anybody. My colleague at Harvard, Richard Foreman, in what's really a very good book called Urban Regions, says that ecologists have basically dropped balance of nature and equilibrium community from their vocabulary. Instead, they emphasize the non-equilibrium nature of nature, since the scientific evidence overwhelmingly highlights changes as the norm. Indeed, the prevention of disturbance rather than disturbance itself is the threat. So by that, what he means is that we can't prevent what are called natural disasters, but that instead we have to prepare for them in ways that make sense. And I don't disagree with that, but I want to focus on the ways in which various policymakers have thought that they were preparing for it. Now, interestingly, long ago, when I was a graduate student, I was in political science, everybody who studied urban politics read this article by Norton Long called The Local Community as an Ecology of Games. I'm sure those of you who are much younger have never heard of him or it, but it made an argument that was really very much a precursor to the present argument about multiple causality and ecology and multiple variables. I'm going to not read the whole thing, but it's important when he says it makes it appear that inclusive overall organization for many general purposes is weak or non-existent. Everybody's seeking to realize their own goals, and it's all this interaction among everybody doing all these different things. He's not talking about nature, he's just talking about interests in the city, but the point he's making is that there's nobody who dominates. Now, you have to realize that this is in the context of a particular debate over what was called community power structure. Whether, as Floyd Hunter argued, there were elites who ran, or C. Wright Mills, that there were elites that ran things, or whether or not, in fact, there was a very high level of pluralism, nobody was running anything. So Long came out very much that nobody was running anything. This very much prefigures Holling and Gunderson's concept of panarchy. Nobody is running anything. So what this means is that there's a kind of blindness to the actuality of power. If you look at pluralist theory then, and I think pluralist theory has now become unfashionable, and I guess one of the points I really am making is that different terms, different paradigms become fashionable or unfashionable, not necessarily based on their accuracy or their applicability, but simply because new generations come along and new concepts become stylish, as in fact resilience now is. But at any rate, the pluralists who are no longer stylish, but the complexity theorists who now are, but are more or less saying the same thing, ignore the structuring of the system in which the relationship between society and nature is formed and in which it's reproduced. Kathy Wilkinson, in another article, I think it was in the journal Planning Theory, I should have been better about citations here, said that socio-ecological resilience is most relevant for normative planning theory rather than critical planning theory, given that it has yet to develop a strong theoretical basis for addressing matters of power, conflict, contradiction, and culture. Well, I'm not quite sure what the distinction she's making between normative and critical planning theory is, but it's certainly the case that the concept of resilience has not addressed matters of power, conflict, contradiction, and culture. And these are the issues that I do wish to address today. Now, here's a chart that I think illustrates the point and illustrates why resilience is such a popular concept. This came out of the Davos people, the World Economic Forum. It shows the risk interconnection map. All the little squares are different kinds of crises that occur when different variables interact with different variables. And as you see by looking at this web, nobody dominates, nobody controls, everything is sort of like a pinball machine hitting against everything else. Oh dear, we say, my goodness, what can we do about this? The term market failure is often used to talk about the bad things that can happen. So it's very impersonal. All of this is going on, and every once in a while markets fail to resolve the process. Now, why there's any reason for us to think that markets should have done anything to solve the situation, and thus it's only because it didn't do it in this particular instance, I'm not quite sure. But you have to see the way in which all of this is part of a particular ideology, really a hegemonic ideology. So I'm going to talk about a Marxist structuralist perspective, and some number of you will say, oh no, that's so 1970s. That is so passé. David Harvey still does it, but we all know that this is no longer the way in which we rigorous social scientists ought to talk. But I would argue that a Marxist structuralist perspective, actually much better than complexity theory, does in fact describe the particular issues involved in the interaction between humans and nature and humans and each other in this particular historical moment. So Marx's analysis, like complexity theory, rejects the idea that, or I should say recent Marxist analysis, rejects the idea that humans should simply or do simply dominate nature, that rather there is an interaction between nature and human activity. What's different is the understanding of that relationship. I should note that Marx himself took very much a 19th century scientific progress view and saw humans as being above nature, but more recent theorists do not. So I have a quote from Neil Smith in which he says that in its uncontrolled drive for universality, capitalism creates new barriers to its own future. It creates a scarcity of needed resources, impoverishes the quality of those resources not yet devoured, breeds new diseases, develops a nuclear technology that threatens the future of all humanity, pollutes the entire environment that we must consume in order to reproduce, and in the daily work process, it threatens the very existence of those who produce the vital social wealth. So this is a restatement of the Marxist argument having to do with the contradictions of capitalism, and it's a quite different way of saying what's in certain ways the same thing as that complicated diagram from the World Economic Forum. But what it has associated with it is, of course, a rhetoric which says that, that somebody's at fault here, that there are, in fact, people who dominate the process, and that in doing so, they create crises which are threatening to undermine the whole system, that capitalism is, in fact, a crisis-prone system. David Harvey comments that the discourse of scientific rationalism disguises the question of the relationship between humans and nature as a technical discourse concerning the proper allocation of scarce resources. Now, interestingly, I came across at the same time, pretty much, an RFP from the Rockefeller Foundation on the subject exactly of how public and private sector leaders have neither the technical expertise nor the financial resources, exactly what Harvey's talking about. It's all a matter of technical expertise and financial resources to create and execute resilience strategies. So the problem isn't class conflict, the problem isn't domination, the problem isn't a hegemonic ideology of neoliberalism. No, the problem just is that we aren't technically advanced enough to know how to deal with these problems. Harvey argues that what he calls the ecological modernization movement, which is the one that says that we can be green and at the same time do good for everyone, is simultaneously profitable. Well, the argument of the movement is that it's simultaneously profitable and good for the environment. So cap and trade, for example, would be one way in which ecological modernization says we can deal with environmental stress. But what this means, of course, is that approaches that are neither profitable nor protective of private property will be implemented. Harvey instead emphasizes environmental justice and says that the environmental justice movement makes protection of the most vulnerable the first priority rather than protection of private property. Now, there's a new book which has gotten a huge amount of publicity in the United States by Bruce Katz and Jennifer Bradley of the Brookings Institution, which is also concerned with resilience, which again takes this view that it's everybody working together that's going to overcome the kinds of environmental crises and economic crises currently afflicting American cities in this case. So they say, I think when you have coalitions of mayors, civic leaders, labor leaders, business leaders, all coming along and showing that change can really happen on the ground, that this is a powerful example. So apparently there are really no important differences among mayors, civic leaders, labor leaders, business leaders, and I suppose we would add poor and vulnerable people as well. So let me summarize what would be a Marxist perspective on resilience and environmental crisis, which is first that the contradictions in capitalism make environmental despoliation inevitable. Now, I'm not going to take the position that socialism wouldn't have these problems too, but certainly we see that, especially when we look at the way in which environmental problems are displaced from the first world to what's now come to be known as the global south, a term I don't like, but you know what I mean, so we send all our pollution to Africa or to parts of Asia from the United States. The Marxists, like non-Marxists, take the view, and there's a book recently published called There's No Such Thing as a Natural Disaster, that environmental crisis is not simply natural, that it's a product of human activity, but the difference is that Marxists, in fact, are willing to assess blame. Well, obviously, the people they blame are capitalists. It's deeply political, unlike complexity theory, which is distinguished by being non-political. The problem is that, and there are real weaknesses to this theoretical approach, is that besides mobilizing on behalf of the weak, it doesn't tell you what to do very much. And in particular, it doesn't tell you as planners what to do in the present period. Moreover, there's always this kind of utopian assumption, a benign assumption, that somehow under a socialist regime, the contradictions that result in environmental crisis would be gone, which I think is simply wishful thinking. But still, if you had less in the market, you would have less pressure for constantly producing various kinds of pollution. So that even though one can criticize Marxism for having a utopian ideal which is not realizable, at the same time, its depiction of the environmental consequences of capitalist development is not incorrect. And moreover, complexity theory, with its multiplicity of variables and numerous feedback effects, isn't any more practical. I mean, if you're going to say, well, Marxism is just pie in the sky or not practical, well, what is it about that diagram that the Davos people produced that would lead you to know in particular what to do about anything? Now, the second aspect of the discussion of resilience right now that I want to point to, and I'm going to have to move a little faster, is that small-scale changes in the system amplify and cascade into major shifts. This is what in Hegelian thought was the dialectic of ideas. In Marxist thought, it was the materialist dialectic or historical materialism. But the argument is that small changes will produce a qualitative leap. The term creative destruction is often used in terms of the kinds of changes that produce a qualitative leap. The difference between the Marxist and Schumpeterian views of creative destruction is whether you're rooting for the creators or you're concerned about the people who are being destroyed. Dialectical thinking, at any rate, allows the identification of new qualitative changes. And in the form of regulation theory, it regards conventional thinking, the conventional thinking that says, oh, resilience is a problem that affects everybody in some way equally, that using Marxist terminology is unstylish and really too ideological, that in fact when you talk about deregulation, privatization, cap and trade, that in fact what you're talking about is a neoliberal ideology, that these are as ideological as Marxist thought is ideological. So dialectical analysis leads you to identify the contradictions of capitalism, its crisis-prone nature. On the other hand, capitalism, to use this term of today, is remarkably resilient. But still, we have to, as Marx and his followers remind us, constantly think about the economic structure. Dialectical analysis reveals relationships within the system between the economy, society, and nature, but it does not, in fact, predict what the ultimate outcome will be. Among the different approaches right now to resilience that have become popular, what Patsy Healy calls traveling ideas, is the idea of making room for water. This has come out of the Netherlands, and I have this photograph here, which I took from my living room window at the time of a flood in the 1970s. My living room looked out on the Raritan River in New Jersey, and the banks of the Raritan, in fact, were in the 1930s redeveloped as parks to make room for water. This is not a new idea, even though somehow everybody seems at this moment to think it is. The reason that we don't make room for water is because there's profitability to be made from building on waterways, or the idea of letting wildfires burn away, but people like to build expensive houses within woods. So there are a lot of problems with making room for water or returning to natural ways of doing things. The second traveling idea is selecting strategies through participatory processes, but when we do that, we often find that, for example, suburban homeowners' idea of participation is we shouldn't build anything around them for example, low-income people because it will have negative environmental effects, but on the other hand, we can have green lawns and golf courses and all these other nature-affecting ways of doing things, but in ways that are beneficial to people who are private property owners. So as Healy warns, we have to be alert about how we apply these ideas, and in particular, and this is the argument I would most make about planning process, we have to examine who gains and who loses. So I heard a recent lecture by a friend of mine who I respect highly, but about the Dutch making room for water, and I said, well, but what about when the environmentally most sensitive places are in fact occupied by low-income people, as is frequently the case? Do we just move them out, which is what the planning profession originally prescribed for New Orleans in what was known as the green dot map, where they put green dots on all the low-income areas that were in low-lying areas. Also in New Orleans, the hurricane was used, Katrina, as the rationale for demolishing all public housing. So what then would be a just approach to dealing with the threat of environmental disaster? Well, you might say that you ought to move people out of areas that are particularly environmentally sensitive, but what you have to do is move a whole community together at once to someplace decent and provide them with sufficient resources to have a new community that allows them to lead decent lives. So simply compensating people for the very low value of their houses is not going to provide them with enough resources to, in fact, be somewhere else. And if you're a renter, they don't provide you with anything. The question about participation is who participates and what form does it take? Ultimately, in New Orleans, when there was so much furor over the idea of getting rid of the lower Ninth Ward, they said, well, everybody can do anything they want as long as they can raise the resources to do it. But what this has meant is that the areas that were more privileged were able to rebuild and other areas weren't. Resilience is often defined as a return to normality. But what we regard as normal is often what produces great insecurity for vulnerable groups. I had various people, the director of planning in Amsterdam, when I commented that they were greatly reducing construction of social housing, said to me proudly, yes, we are becoming a normal city. So normal tends to mean what we expect, that is capitalist hierarchical development. So in a more just system, vulnerable groups would not only be given priority, but they would also be provided with a much higher level of resources than if they were, well, let me put it another way. If they are participating, they need to be given control over resources, not simply to give advice. Planning for resilience is usually an exercise in risk assessment. It's done with these very precise calculations, but as another Planning Theory and Practice article commented, the clearest message from the changing evidence base over the last decade concerns the dangers of false precision. With regard to flooding, the data appear to be particularly subject to rapid and fundamental change. Everybody in New York is right now waiting for the newest flood maps to come out because the flood maps will determine their insurance rates. And the insurance industry demands these risk assessments in terms of where flooding will occur. But what we immediately found out when we had the last Hurricane Sandy was that the previous flood maps were all wrong. And there's no particular reason to think that the next ones will be any better. There have been three, I wanted to conclude by the case of New York. There have been three recent significant crises: the World Trade Center attack, the financial crisis, and Hurricane Sandy. The term resilience has been around, connected with New York for a while. So a book on post-9/11 and the economy of New York was called The Resilient City. What's striking to me was that after 9/11, a huge amount of federal money flowed into New York, unlike after the fiscal crisis of '75, when there was the famous Daily News, or was it Post, New York Post headline saying Ford to city dropped dead. We have more recently a greater willingness on the part of the federal government to recognize the importance of New York. After the financial crisis, the TARP, the assistance program, put a huge amount again of money into New York because that's where all the financial institutions were located. And we've just had a new report from the mayor just last month called A Stronger, More Resilient, he certainly heard the word, New York. And what are we going to do to save Lower Manhattan, that is the Wall Street area, from flooding of the East River, which happened in Sandy, and all the buildings pretty much downtown got flooded? Well, we're going to build a mega project on the East River, a giant project of high-end condos and office buildings, which will be raised and therefore act as a buffer or dike against the rising of the East River. So our solution to the problem of New York's vulnerability is yet one more expensive real estate development. So a plan based on a concept of urban justice would start out with the most vulnerable populations and develop alternatives that would best protect them. Right now, there are a lot of alternatives being developed that would best protect those people who have very expensive waterside homes. It would compensate those who lost their livelihood as a matter of physical and economic disaster. Now, compensation now is largely based on what your projected lifetime earnings are. So if you're a low-income earner, your compensation is low, and if you're a high-income earner, your compensation is high. In response to financial crisis, making whole those people who own homes who are poor rather than attempting to salvage banks might be your first approach to resilience. My conclusion then is that if you think in other terms besides the one that says, oh, well, resilience is a problem for everyone, and what we have to do is look at 1,000 variables and try to address each one of them, I guess, or I'm not quite sure, actually, once you say that there are 1,000 variables, how you approach it, but that the more just approach would be, in fact, to look first at vulnerable populations and to figure out ways in which you can, in fact, address their particular situation. Thank you.
Lucy Natarajan, UCL, and I am very much...
Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, sorry, Lucy Natarajan, UCL, London, and my question to you would be, given what you've said about theory and our academic pursuits needing to be more directed by the most vulnerable communities. Do you have any thoughts about who those might be, and to help us in our trying to follow through on what your challenge is?
Well, obviously from the standpoint I'm coming from, the most vulnerable communities are those people who are poorest, but also those people who are disabled, who are excluded because of color or of sexual orientation. We're pretty good at identifying groups which are vulnerable. The real question, and the one which I kind of shrunk from answering, is if there isn't a mobilization on behalf of these groups, why would planners in fact give them priority? That there has to be political backing for them. Right now we're seeing a great deal of political activity in the streets, but that it doesn't seem to be directed at a very clear-cut set of goals, and in fact it seems so diffuse as to not be a program in any kind of way. Oh, okay.
To the right to the front, please. The very, very front. We've done this on purpose, the very, very back to the very, very front.
Ben Davy, University of Dortmund. You've quoted a number of disasters, and very often part of resilient politics includes to come up with measures and plans to prevent that this is going to happen again. So if you have a flooding, you build dikes, or if you have a terrorist attack, you establish homeland security, and everybody has to suffer the consequences. I wonder, though, with respect to one of the disasters you've been quoting, the so-called financial crisis, why was the system so slow to establish, in fact, mechanisms to prevent that such financial crises would repeat themselves? In Ireland, if you talk to cab drivers, they're extremely furious right now about the tapes of Anglo-Irish bankers, and they feel that there are a few greedy persons who have exploited the situation that makes everybody suffer. Yet they also say, and I'm referring to the experiences of cab drivers, everyday experiences, so to speak, they also feel that nobody does anything to prevent these things from recurring. My question to you is, do you, from your perspective, have an explanation to that and maybe a solution even?
Well, I don't know if I have a solution, but the explanation's not hard to find. There's been enormous resistance on the part of financial institutions to regulation. The whole ideology of deregulation makes it very difficult to institute new regulations. There isn't a great public understanding of the relationship between, for example, in the United States, when they eliminated the Glass-Steagall Act, which was the Banking Regulation Act, and that was under Clinton, and it was called a reform. We use the term reform to describe getting rid of regulation. The pressure groups and campaign contributions from bankers make it very difficult for legislation to occur. In Europe, the central bank of the European Union is very opposed to using fiscal measures to overcome depression or recession. And so I don't think it's too hard to find out the explanation. And I don't see anything much happening that would prevent a similar bubble from occurring again.
Just there.
Hi, David Lewis, University at Albany. Susan, you talked about the movement in the street, and I'm thinking about the Occupy Wall Street movement that you were referring to. And you said it was so diffuse that it amounts to nothing, but there were 350 encampments, and every one of them were forcibly removed by the state. If it was so diffuse and so unpowerful...
Could you talk a little more slowly, because I can't
Sure.
understand you?
In terms of the Occupy Wall Street movement,
Yeah.
there was 350 encampments across the United States. They were all forcibly removed by the state. If it was so diffuse and so undirected, why did the state have to come in and remove all those encampments?
Oh, well, I think it was certainly seen as a threat. I'm just saying that it would have been more effective if it had a program. It's certainly questioned the legitimacy of the state, and we have been having a crisis of legitimacy. But a crisis of legitimacy doesn't necessarily produce in its aftermath a new regime and a new set of policies. And if you only look at what's happening in, for example, Egypt now, well, they got rid of Mubarak, but it doesn't mean that they have come out with a decent governing structure or a set of, or a program that would make lives better for the people who were in fact partly protesting or maybe mainly protesting because of their economic situation. So that we can have crises. Look, we had, in the Middle Ages, we had innumerable peasant rebellions, but it doesn't mean that, that it produced an outcome that made lives better for the European peasant. So that rebellion exists, but it doesn't necessarily have a focus. And one of the problems, it isn't that I want to defend socialism as it really existed, but when it really existed, it created a threat in the West that led to the welfare state, because it said, look, we can do things for you without having a socialist system. Now, with that threat gone, there's much less pressure towards a redistributive state.
I'm going to take two more questions, and I'm sorry that I'm having to be selective. There was one over on this side, so that I haven't ignored the right of the room. Come forward. Yes, Willem.
Thank you. My name is Willem Salet from Amsterdam. I tried to understand Karl Marx, and I think I did. Karl Marx is saying capitalist accumulation brings us to hell. I tried to understand Holling and Gunderson, the concept of panarchy. I think I failed. I'm not a mathematician. What I understand from it, it is a very complex order, a sort of self-regulation. And then, in a sort of mysterious way, they tell it is resilient. And then comes Susan. Susan says, capitalism is surprisingly resilient. And this really surprised me. I thought capitalism is not resilient at all. It brings us to disaster.
It's still with us, Willem. What you see is that there's crisis after crisis, and they are the kinds of crises that were predicted by Marx or predicted by Keynes, as far as that goes, of crises of overaccumulation, crises of legitimacy. But the system has not been replaced, and in many ways, in fact, it's more dominant because we've seen the real decline of counter movements. We see a sort of, I guess I would even call it anarchist move towards saying that the order that's being imposed on is very bad, but it's saying let's get rid of this order rather than saying what kind of new order should be there. And I guess as somebody who was trained in political theory, I have to say that the problem of order is a very serious one. I take Hobbes very seriously, and so the idea of let's just get rid of it all is not one that I can go along with, which seems to me too much a part of what's the current set of rebellions are like. And in particular, if you say, well, the state is bad, well, if you don't have the state being the actor, which in fact redistributes I don't know what else is. I don't think we can have a government by commune, for example, which seems to be the only form of governance that I see coming out of the Occupy movement.
One final point from the left of the room.
Peter Marcus from Colombia.
Is it working?
I like the idea of applying the dialectic, little changes leading to bigger changes leading to qualitative change, but it seems to me not always to work that way, and specifically the idea of using the guiding principle of helping those who need it most, the Rawls second principle, and so forth, in the use of flood-prone areas, for instance.
I'm sorry, in the which?
Flood-prone areas, where very often the poor are the worst affected. Giving them help or making them less poor does not lead to dealing with the underlying problem. The underlying problem has something to do with the structure of planning, the structure of land allocation, the idea that the market should put land to its highest and best use, which is determined by its profitability.
Okay.
That's not an outcome of the idea of helping those that need it most.
Yeah, I understand, Peter, your point perfectly well, but I don't think that planning is going to restructure society. In fact, not at all. And therefore, within what I'm always concerned with, and we've had this discussion, of course, in the past, is within the here and now, what is it that planning can do? And what it can do is have a particular focus on these kinds of areas. In Singapore, where I've spent a fair amount of time lately, when they get rid of they do something similar to the Hope 6 in the United States, that is saying, here is distressed public housing, we're going to tear it down. When they do that, they move everybody, as they call it, en bloc. That is, they move everybody who's in that unit, in the building, in the whole building, to another building. They do that before they tear down the present building. That is, they build their new habitation before they tear down where they're living, and then they tear down where they had been living. This is not something that I know of any other place doing. And it's within the confines of, yes, a capitalist structure, a very top-down system, but it's still more humane within that structure than what we do, which is to simply tear down all the public housing and say, go find some place to live.
Okay, I should draw this together. It's for us to hand over to the boys' team now. I'd like to thank Susan very much again for her thought-provoking presentation.